question you're probably asking yourself is, who is this guy? So I fit into a number of roles, and I'm probably playing about 3 or 4 at the moment. But in this capacity, I am the founder and webmaster of a disability consciousness blog called the Disability Diaries. At the same time, I am the administrator for IPDM and Shanaza Dole's assistant. But what I'm generally focusing on is everyday life, reasonable accommodation, but a bit more than that, because it's less accommodation in terms of ramps, doorways, and the physical infrastructure, but more what I focus particularly on is social consciousness. So in terms of reasonable accommodation, there's been a slight problem with the program in that the title I originally gave this had been changed, but what it was initially was Reasonable Accommodation in Life, Names, Ideas, and Actions Matter. So one of the key and probably most controversial concepts that I have been focusing on particularly recently is the idea of the terminology, and particularly the legal term, person with a disability. Why I disagree with that, I'm going to get to in a minute, but why I particularly focus on terminology is terminology ties to ideology. Ideology ties to the way social structures happen, and if you can manipulate how social structure is developed, you can change the way they think. I read a book recently by a man called Charles Duhigg, The Power of Habit. Why this is particularly good is he talks about a concept called a keystone habit, where if you change that keystone habit, it'll have a knock-on effect over time and boil into a more sustainable lifestyle. So rather than, an example he used was weight loss. Rather than, I want to lose 50 kilos, all I want to do is I want to walk 1 kilometer every day. And then that'll boil into, I want to eat healthier, blah, blah, blah. Admittedly, I know nothing about weight loss. I've never been out of this figure for some reason. But, so why person with a disability irritates me is because of the way it's phrased. Just think of what happens when you think of a person with a something. Is that person endemically tied to that thing, or is it just ascribed to them? Can you identify as something that you have? Does something along the lines of, I have cancer? When you think person with a disability, what I hear is person with a disease. And fundamentally, while some disabilities are disease-like in nature, they are in and of themselves not a disease. So by phrasing it with person with a disability, I have a bit of an issue because I'm not diseased. At the same time, to be a little bit crude, but the terminology works. Someone I know from the disability sector uses the phrase virgin, non-virgin disability for the I'm born with a disability and the I have an accident and therefore I become disabled. So the idea is you are a virgin in terms of no experience of able-bodied life. Now if you think of how one's identity is formed as a person, it's fundamentally your nature and your nurture. So it's partly your genes, but also fundamentally the environment in which you grow up. So if you have something like a congenital disability and born with a disability, do you agree with me that disability is fundamentally an element of your identity, even if not the entire part? So that's where this idea of the connotation of disability equals disease, that's where I have a problem. Because it's fundamentally part of my identity. I'm not diseased, I am disabled. But also, I come from a UCT literature background, and I pay attention to every single word. So I identify as having disability as fundamentally part of my identity. So I have a right to do that, as does anyone have the right to identify as anything, regardless of where that fits in. But the problem that I find happens a lot is by having person with a disability, just think of the phrasing, person with a disability. So if you have the right to identify as disabled, why are they separating the disability from the person? If you look at it as a written phrase, you're physically segregating disability and the person. But if we also know that disability forms, yes, one part, but a part nonetheless of your identity, then you can see my quandary in that you are segregating a part of my identity from me. You're not letting me take ownership of it. Also, as we all know, society is fundamentally ableist. Whether we'd like to admit it or not, society is fundamentally ableist. And by saying you have a disability you are still a fully functioning person in society who happens to have something that makes life a little bit more difficult. But here's where disabled person for me particularly becomes powerful. By saying you're a disabled person, you're not giving them the right to let you think of as a person with something that is more or less irrelevant. But by saying you're a disabled person, you are saying your ability to be a fully functioning person of society is inherently disabled by the fact that society isn't geared for your way of life. And also, if you look at LGBT politics in the 60s, there was a surge of, I'm not just a homosexual, but I identify as a gay person, because it boils down to more than just my sexual orientation. It's part of my identity as a whole. I treated disability in a very similar vein. But how this ties to reasonable accommodation, if we change the way people think about how disability is in a social paradigm, we create a new, to use Charles Duhigg's terminology, we create a new keystone habit. By manipulating the keystone habit, it will boil into the education system. It will then boil into the way people are trained in architecture and social development and law, and then things like an Americans with Disabilities Act. What's another one that was a good one? Then you'd also see architects not just designing new buildings that are disabled friendly, but they would also have this view of, I see this building that is badly designed. It is creating a physical pain for me to see this because it's not the way society should be. Let's go back and change it. But why that's not the political perspective is if you think of how democracy works. People vote for a government. But people, also from a philosophical perspective, there was someone in the 17th century who argued that humans are inherently selfish at a psychological level. So if you use that mentality, why would people vote for something that doesn't change their life? But if you look at the things like Stonewall riots in the 60s, they were trying to change the way people view people. But that's only going to happen in a few generations' time. I'm of the opinion that to try and save the generation in the current moment is just unfeasible. But if we were to start changing from the ground level, from teaching 6-, 7-year-olds and teaching architects and psychologists and lawyers, we can create an effect for 50 to 60 years' time where things change. The thing is, we have to almost disregard the current moment. As sad as that is, I can see no other way through it. And I know people disagree with me, but that's just how I view things. But reasonable accommodation is not about whether you put ramps in place. It's how you view people. Society is fundamentally social. We want to engage with each other. I don't see how reasonable accommodation in any other way but changing how we relate to people on a fundamental level is any different. We change the way we relate to people, we change the keystone habit. We change the keystone habit, we change the society as we know it.